So my name's Aliya, and I work for an organisation called Migrants Organise, and I will try and keep this a bit short, but like to ensure there are time for sort of questions and maybe some discussion also after, if that's what we want to do. I really want to say a huge thank you to all of the organisers of today's event and the whole biennial, because I think creating spaces for our collective imagining of a world. Welcome to you too. Sure. They all welcome. Yes, creating spaces where we can collectively imagine spaces that we can call home, I think it's really beautiful and really powerful. So thank you for putting on these events and for all the exciting things that are going to be happening today as part of the Day of Action Against the Hostile Environment. At Migrants Organise, we work with migrants, asylum seekers and refugees and people who are at the sharpest edges of the hostile environment immigration system to fight against the current system of oppression. Whilst challenging the violence of the hostile environment, we also provide practical support for people such as legal advice, counselling, emergency accommodation, English language classes, activities, spaces to build community and so on, because people cannot organise unless they can physically survive. As sort of mentioned, organising is the work of bringing people together to take action around their common concerns. And in doing so, we reach out, we listen, we connect, we motivate people to build our collective power in our communities. And we organise around the things that are affecting our members at Migrants Organise in the here and now. So I particularly work on access to healthcare, which I'll talk about a little bit through this speech. I'm also definitely going to slow down because I'm talking way too fast. So I want to start with a story about someone who I work really closely with, whose name is Simba Mujakachi. And Simba was actually one of the people I met when I first started at Migrants Organise back in 2019. Simba came to Britain when he was 14 years old with his family. His dad was a lecturer at a university in London. He came with his parents and his brothers. He went to school here. He was a basketball player for Kent on his school team. And sort of after they arrived here, his dad spoke out against the Zimbabwean government. And quite quickly, a warrant was put out in Zimbabwe for his dad and his family's arrest, and wishes were made against the family. So they had to claim asylum. Our asylum system is notoriously terrible. It took a very long time, during which time Simba actually had turned 18, and he then had to make his own asylum application because he was no longer eligible to make it with his family. There were a lot of delays. The family sort of became refused, and slashes to legal aid meant that Simba and his family weren't able to have any support in applying for asylum. Simba had been dreaming of going to university and he was now unable to, and he was also moved away from his dad and his brothers into asylum accommodation where they had to live separately. He was also having to spend the meagre £35 a week that he was given, mostly on train tickets to travel to an immigration reporting centre, which he had to do once every 2 weeks. Then Simba got sick. So all of this is part of this hostile environment immigration system, right, designed to make life extremely difficult for people who have moved here and who are here for lots of different reasons. Because of his status as a refused asylum seeker, despite having lived here for more than half of his life and his entire adult life, he was not entitled to free NHS care. I feel like that's metaphorical for something, but I'm not sure what. And Simba had a blood clotting condition, and he'd been seeing the GP about this because GP primary care is free for everybody, regardless of your immigration status. But he then needed sort of more treatment, and he was getting referred to his local hospital when he started getting told that he would be charged for this care. So he stopped going. He was terrified of accruing a bill for thousands and thousands of pounds, which he was told would make a big difference to any future asylum application he would make, which is actually not true, but it's something that people get told. And so he didn't get the treatment that he needed. But he had this blood clotting condition and he continued to get sick. Also added with the other pressures of the hostile environment, his dad was in immigration detention, threatened with removal. The family had to do a big campaign to stop that happening, which they won, which is amazing. But all of these pressures and stresses of the hostile environment meant that Simba got more and more sick. And he then had quite a severe bleed in his brain, which led to him having a stroke. He was rushed to hospital, where he had to undergo life-saving brain surgery, and he was then in a medical coma for 2 weeks, fighting for his life. He, against sort of all the odds, survived, woke up, and one of the first things that happened when he woke up from the stroke was that the hospital finance department came to him and said, "Simba, you now have a bill for £100,000. Simba tells this slightly dark but kind of funny joke, which is that he's surprised he didn't have another stroke when he saw that bill, because he was like completely in awe of how he thought they expected him to pay. He's not allowed to work as a refused asylum seeker. Asylum seekers aren't allowed to work in this country, but also it's an insane amount of money. Simba's story isn't an accident, and nor is his case isolated. This is part of the hostile environment, this concerted attempt by the government to demonize migrants and to push vast sections of our communities into the margins of society, to scapegoat them for the crises of capitalism and of this government that we're living through. And I think before I talk a bit more about the hostile environment and how we fight back against it, I think I want to say something about sort of borders and our imagining that I think is maybe not super obvious, but is super important, which is that at their core, borders are not natural and they're not necessary. They have not always existed, and they do not prevent human movement, and nor do they protect most people, if anyone. Borders are a historically contingent ordering regime that is continually produced and reproduced through a number of different processes, both at a physical border, passport control, but also things like pushing people back with boats in the Mediterranean, or fining airlines so that they will refuse to let people without the right documentations board, but also through internal processes like the hostile environment. These borders fail to address any of the conditions that shape the reasons why people move in the first place: global inequality, exploitation, the dispossession of lands and livelihoods, climate breakdown. And they make people who do move more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse in that movement. We cannot disassociate the creation and reproduction of Britain's current border regimes without taking into consideration the borders of the past and Britain's long colonial border policy. Sivanandan once said, "Colonialism and immigration are part of the same continuum. We are here because you were there." And it's a reminder that we must be in the here and now as much anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist as we are pro-migrant or pro-refugee. What we are ultimately dreaming of is a world where people are free to move and are free to stay. And that doesn't just mean advocating for free movement in the world as it is now, but also calling for and striving for and building a total transformation of the conditions to which borders have been erected as a response. There's a really amazing book that's just recently come out by Gracie May Bradley and Luc de Noronha called Against Borders, and I highly recommend that people read it. The explicit purpose of the hostile environment, which was erected sort of officially 10 years ago, although it's been around for a lot longer than that, was to make life so unbearable and undignified and unlivable for what the government called illegal migrants, to make them go home, which has now become official government policy with the Rwanda policy, right? Which is like taking the slurs of "go back to Africa" that children would hear in their playgrounds. It's now turned it into actual state policy. The reality of immigration is that there's actually no such thing as an illegal migrant. There are just simply people who fall foul of the current process of immigration controls and borders that are designed to prevent the very people who built the majority of the world's wealth from accessing it. Under the hostile environment, we've seen schools forced to share children's data with the Home Office, landlords forced to check people's immigration status before they're allowed to rent a house, doctors and nurses turned into border guards, blurring the lines between immigration enforcement and the vital public services that people need to live. You now can't open a bank account. You can't get a job, you can't get a driver's license, you can't get married without your immigration status being checked and being refused if you don't have the right one. These are sort of these new processes of internal bordering, technologies for which that are rapidly developing with the rise of things like big data. From my work at Migrants Organise, it's not an exaggeration to say that our public services have been turned into this frontier of border control. So in the NHS, what this looks like is a significant expansion in charging for healthcare. First by linking immigration status with entitlement to the NHS, which didn't exist before, excluding hundreds of thousands of people who living here who, for whatever reason, are undocumented or underdocumented, like we saw with the Windrush scandal. And then by introducing upfront charging back in 2017. So essentially now, if you don't have the right immigration status and you can't pay for your healthcare, too bad. You're not going to get it. It's a powerful and repressive system that connects this to the Grenfell fire, to the ongoing impunity of Windrush, the hostile environment, to the disproportionate number of Black, brown, and migrant communities who died at the hands of the COVID-19 pandemic, the repression of Black Lives Matter protesters, to the government criminalizing people seeking asylum, arriving by dinghy, and kidnapping them to and dumping them in open-air prisons in Rwanda. This is state racism in Britain, which has joined with the rise of the far right across the world, and it's bearing directly on our people and our communities in our lives and on the streets. I feel like it's a pretty bleak picture. It's not, it's quite grim. The government has power. They have organized people and they have money. But we also have people. In fact, we have many, many more people. But we're currently quite fragmented. And we have to build our collective power if we're going to be able to dismantle this violent system. And funnily enough, the hostile environment actually presents some opportunities, quite a lot of opportunities to do that. Because by seeking to turn everyone whose role it is to care and support people now into border guards, whether that's your neighbor, your student, or your patient, and this is what we have to remember when we build our campaigns, that everyone who is now being recruited to be a border guard, we must now recruit to be fighters for justice, equality, and to stand up for everybody's rights. Our power comes from our people. If enough of us work together, we can change things. In other words, people's power is effective when we are organized, when we have the ability to act in solidarity. Welcome. Not only based on our own experience, but a shared collective experience of the systemic hostile environment policy. And lots of this work is already underway. Healthcare workers, for example, are fighting back under the banner of patients, not passports, where they're organizing inside hospitals to refuse to let the NHS be used as a tool of border control. And we've seen significant U-turns from the government, like in making sure there'd be no immigration checks when people went to get the coronavirus vaccine, for example, and that would be free for everybody. And there have been lots of other wins too. I was going to show a campaign video of Simba's, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that now, but you can find it. Simba organized in his community in Sheffield. His partner set up a petition which was signed by 80,000 people, and he held sort of actions in Sheffield where hundreds of people marched to the hospital to hand in that petition and say to the hospital, you should stop charging Simba for care. And earlier this year, Simba won that campaign. He was granted refugee status after 11 years of fighting, and his entire £100,000 NHS bill was scrapped. There have been other victories against the hostile environment. Schools ABC, also known as Against Borders for Children, was a campaign made up of teachers, parents, and primary school students. And in 2018, they fought and won to stop the government using schools to collect information about parents and families' nationalities, and then they were using that information to deport people. And schools have stopped doing that. This movement for migrant justice last month successfully grounded the first flight to Rwanda that was due to take off. And that was, everyone playing a different role, from the lawyers who were working in the 11th hour to the people who physically stopped one of the immigration vans from taking people to the airport, to everyone who raised awareness on social media, to the demonstrations that were called in at immigration removal centers right across the country. There was something happening everywhere. We've seen asylum seekers in the ex-military barracks, Napier barracks, organising themselves, going on hunger strikes and having demonstrations to demand better conditions in these prisons and for governments to ultimately close the camps. You might have seen the incredible work that anti-raids groups have been doing in places like Glasgow, in London, across the country, resulting in, in Glasgow, and for politicians to stop all immigration raids there. And this network of anti-raids groups has sprung up right across the country. And at Migrants Organise, we're working with our members and migrant communities to produce something called the Fair Immigration Movement Charter, which we've worked on over a number of years. And under its banner, and the banner Solidarity Knows No Borders, which you'll see around, people are coming together to resist what's happening under the hostile environment. And I'm going to end there, but I wanted to show finally like a little video about what we've been up to, and I hope it works.